This is a little bit of a grab bag of advice to round out talking about assessment of development or use. So we'll talk about the phases of development, emphasising, particularly for big projects, how much goes on before the actual submission of the development application. Talk about the scope and nature of an application, in particular needing to make that really clear. Location and jurisdiction, because this is fundamental to what happens in terms of the review. Is it appropriate use? That's going to depend on where it is. Talk through an example, because you've had an awful lot of theory, and we're going to start moving into more of an application that will let you run through this for yourself. Another spiel about notification representations, just to round a few things out, and importantly, expectations and advice, putting yourself in either the role of the applicant or the assessor, the planning authority. This slide is probably the meat of this lecture. So what I'm presenting here is what needs to be done before you actually submit an application and get a permit. So everything before, to the left of that red application line, is what you're doing before you actually submit the proposal, the application. So you have different phases here: the design part of the project, which is in blue, the environment part of the project, which is in green, and the social part of the project, which is in brown. And you move from very early concept stages: what kind of house do I want to build? Where do I want to buy the block of land? Is it going to be infill? Do I need demolition? What are the neighbours going to be like? What are the neighbours going to think? Who's going to be involved? Who's going to be interested? Who might put in a representation? Who might I need to talk to now rather than dealing with problems later? This image works at all scales too. So if you're thinking of something really big, then that concept phase is very important. I guess this is still where the cable car is that's been proposed for Mount Wellington. We're still talking about what the showstoppers are. Who owns the land? Is the landowner going to give permission? Where's the cable car going to go? What's it going to look like? Who are the stakeholders and how do they feel about this? Once you've got that, whether it's for your very big project, controversial project, or whether it's for a house, you move into the pre-feasibility study, where you might go on site with council, with somebody with botanical, biological expertise, and have a look around. So are there any threatened tree species on your site that are going to be showstoppers? If there are, how do you deal with them? Are some trees to be kept and other trees can be removed? So this pre-feasibility really happens before you start getting stuck into the nitty-gritty of the engineering design and any mitigation measures. So this is pretty important to help make the process run smoothly, and this is where you start setting up those relationships with people who are going to be important in terms of either giving you permission, writing permit conditions, or simply being interested in the development because they're neighbours or somehow involved. That feasibility phase is where you might commission formal environmental impact assessment statements if that's appropriate. Social impact assessment, economic impact assessment is required in the case of projects of state significance. There's a very holistic integrated process that's pretty long and pretty expensive. But for most projects, even for a block that say you were developing in Mount Nelson that had native species on it, even though it's not going to be a big application, you might still need a formal impact assessment just to make it clear what values are there and how they're going to be dealt with. So the left-hand side of this picture is emphasising doing your homework, talking to people early, making sure that you understand what the limitations of the project are, coming up with options, and then detailing those options in a formal way so that people have a chance to have a look. So that when you do actually submit at that red line indicated here, you should know what your permit conditions are. You should have a pretty clear idea of how things are going to pan out. So the right-hand side of this image goes through detailed design and construction, so your actual project construction, making sure that the people on site are abiding by the permit conditions, that they're not coming up with any creative approaches of their own that are outside what they're supposed to do. All sorts of strange things happen on site, people trespassing on other people's property, all sorts of crazy things that should come under the project manager's area that do need to be thought about. And once the project's actually complete, then there's the operation side. So this is something that we talk about quite a bit in environmental impact assessment. It's not just the actual demolition, removal of natural values, it's also the construction, noise, dirt, dust, how you deal with that. It's also the ongoing operation, what's the noise profile going to look like, is there any air pollution involved in the ongoing operation. And for big projects, there's often some sort of decommissioning thought gone into it ahead of time as well. So what is there a bond involved in remediation, for example, of a mining site? So this is useful thinking because it can be applied to any kind of scale and emphasises how important it is to have good relationships with all of the people who are involved. This is partly reinforcement of earlier lectures where we talked about the scope and the actual nature of the application. So what is this? Is this a residential development? Is this a shop? Is this mixed use? Is it commercial? Is it industrial? It's surprising how often councils get submissions where the actual nature of the application is not clear. And this is pretty important in terms of putting in a cover letter that lays out the extent, the scope of the application, how the use is classified. Is this residential? Is this something more? And it makes it clear where it is and what zones apply. This might be something that's easy to assume because perhaps you've done the right thing and you've had quite a little bit of contact with council, and it's easy enough to assume that when you put in your application that council are well aware of the scope and nature of the application. But it's not wise to make the assumption that somebody's going to remember a verbal conversation, and also, particularly for the bigger councils, you probably won't get the same person assessing your application as actually talk to on the phone or talk to when you came in and saw whoever was on duty on the planning desk. So this is something to remember keep in mind too in terms of your communication with us in terms of case studies and examples. Make it clear so that we're not getting partway into your explanation of something and guessing about the scope and nature of the application. So yeah, this will help figure out how this needs to be advertised and puts everybody kind of literally on the same page in terms of what's happening. And it can also mean that you prevent unnecessary appeals and costs when you've put in an application for a residential development, but actually it has a commercial aspect. There's a bodyworks in the garage, or there's some kind of commercial enterprise as part of the building, and it wasn't part of the planning application. So this is where, as the applicant, you'd open yourself right up to appeal and ongoing and unnecessary costs, and it's a pain in the neck for everybody involved. So when you lay out the scope and nature of the application, obviously the location is really important in terms of knowing what zone applies, what overlays apply, particularly the overlays that might not be spatially defined. So bushfires is a good example of this. Knowing where it is makes it much easier for the council officer who's looking at this to figure out exactly what's being proposed and what they might need to do in terms of communicating this to other people. Issues with high watermark is a little bit tricky. High watermark is the sum of all the historical high watermarks, and so you might need to pay for a surveyor for it to be surveyed in accurately. Accurate mapping of the shore is obviously important if your development is going to be quite close to shore. So accuracy of mapping in general is important to give council the best possible chance of figuring out what your risks are and what any potential issues are. And there might be issues, particular issues with applications like marine farming, where the offshore component isn't addressed under LUPAA, but the onshore component is. Dam works, we've talked about this before, the actual dam works don't fall under LUPAA, but any access roads and anything outside the actual delineated area of the dam works does come under LUPAA. Dealing with local government where some part of the application might be in one municipality and the rest of it is actually outside. So this is not uncommon in places like the Sorell-Clarence boundary, where you might have the actual, for example, residential development in Sorell, but the access is through Clarence. So that's something where you have to talk to the councils involved and get them to come to some arrangement for assessment and sharing that. And the last one that you're not going to come across very often, because I think there's only the one federal airport that's on Commonwealth land, Hobart, I'm not sure about Launceston, that is exempt from LUPAA and is dealt with under federal legislation. So airports are little cities, and so it's interesting that they're exempt from normal regulation. So they go through federal legislation, there needs to be a major development plan, and the Minister for Transport at the federal level gets to make the decision. So there might be complications that arise with this where the developer, the applicant for the airport, actually does need services from the local council. So there was a bit of argy-bargy around various parts of the Hobart International Airport where there was land that required additional upgrades to sewage and water. So this is where Clarence did need to be party to what was going on, and just completely sidestepping Clarence gave the council the ability to say, well, we're not going to upgrade your connections unless you give us some information. So you're not going to need to deal with this very often, but just to make you aware of some of the exceptions and the importance of knowing where it is and how the actual nature of the application interacts with the location and the jurisdiction. An example. So this is an upgrade of transmission lines. That's a real application that Dan Ma put in as part of his work for Entura. It's a transmission line between Ballarat and Warragul in Victoria. And so this is roughly the process that he went through to figure out the scope and nature of the development, and then figure out what permits might be required. So here's the kind of that left-hand side of the earlier image and what went on. So the development was terminal stations and transmission lines that were part of a land use that was classified as utility installation. There was requirement for building under Victorian legislation, Planning and Environment Act, that included structures, and this is a fantastic word, appurtenances to structures. So the wires and appendages that were part of the structure. And the actual cables were likely to be considered as appurtenances under the Act. And so they were part of permit requirements around building and works. So this was Dan figuring out, okay, here's where it's going to be built, and this is how it's classified under the Victorian legislation. So now I can start printing out where it is and figuring out the interaction between the development and the receiving environment, so the actual location. In Victoria, this is not as easy as going onto the list and drawing lines, so Dan actually had to print out the relevant PDFs, the maps, tape them together and draw on the transmission line just to get a feel for the whole development, where it was going and what kind of issues might be triggered. So where were the towers? Did they need more towers than were currently there? So what building requirements were there? He wrote what he calls a red flags report. So what might be the deal breakers? What actually isn't permitted currently? So this is something obviously of great importance at that very early concept phase or pre-feasibility phase, somewhere in there, to figure out what might be okay, what's a normal utility installation, and what is not permitted under the planning scheme. In matching up the nature of the development with the actual location, here's the thinking that went on. So he found out that under the Act that a utility installation is not exempt under section 62(1) of the planning scheme, nor are the buildings or works exempted. So he does need a permit, and the process of approval will be identified under the provisions of the zones and overlays. So that early work that he's done to figure out what are the zones, what are the relevant overlays, is all going to need to be taken into consideration. The removal of native vegetation and the need for approval is going to be considered separately. So the existing permits for the towers were fine in terms of the actual ongoing removal of vegetation right underneath the towers, but because of the appurtenances to the structures and possible new towers, there needed to be additional area considered, and so that the whole corridor ended up needing an assessment for vegetation conditions. So that would have included threatened species, any listed weeds that would need to be treated, lots of work for botanical consultants walking under transmission lines. I have done my time in terms of looking for orchids and for nasty weeds tramping along under transmission lines. It's real bread and butter work in terms of environmental impact assessment. So the risk pathway that was described under permitted clearing of native vegetation biodiversity assessment guidelines under both state and there's the final paragraph, federal legislation, both needed to be considered. So then were no doubt, but given it was such a big area, there would have been species listed both under state legislation and under federal legislation that would have needed to be dealt with. Quite often in these kind of disturbed areas, the species that are found are not particularly problematic in terms of removing them because some of them like disturbed ground, and it's more going into areas that don't like disturbance, quite mature, say wet sclerophyll forest, where you can get pretty intractable issues. Riparian areas, so areas near creeks, is another really difficult thing. If you're proposing to completely remove that kind of environment, that's where you can get into problems in terms of not being able to compensate for removal of vegetation and other natural values. So if the development impacts upon nationally listed species or communities, and there are some Victorian communities listed under the federal legislation, or other MNES, matters of national environmental significance, so this is Ramsar wetlands, migratory species, There's a whole list under that EPBC at the national level that make it a controlled action. So if you're interested in this and you haven't already done environmental impact assessment, we cover all of that in detail. This is the next phase of this particular project where Dan went through, figured out the zones for each of the 4 local government areas, Ballarat, Moorabool, Golden Plains and Greater Geelong, figured out what zone the actual line was in, and then figured out how the utility was classified. So note here, section 2 means it's discretionary, that there was a red flag that came up very early on. So in the Golden Plains local government area, in the public conservation and resource zone, they needed to put the line through, but it was a prohibited use of that land. So although it was prohibited, he figured out that the use was already there. So there was a workaround in terms of not intensifying the use, but just applying for building and works under the existing use. So that meant that it was okay. So if they were starting fresh and putting the line in through this public conservation and resource zone, no good. But because the line is already there, they're not actually intensifying the use there, then they have existing use rights. And that's a concept that you should already be familiar with. So there's a bit of text here emphasising the things that I've just said. It's noted that the development is a section 2. This is the actual wording that he put as the expert planner in his report to the applicant. So this requires a permit in all zones except the public conservation and resource zone in Golden Plains. And that applies to a stream crossing. So we're only talking about quite a small area, but it's a use that's already established in the existing transition line easement in that zone. So a change of use is not required, but the applicant will need a permit to build and do works in that zone. Without the establishment of existing use rights, an application couldn't be made because it's prohibited use. So he got legal advice, and that was his advice. So this is where planners anticipate before the DA goes in that there might be a problem and present a solution. Moving from zones to overlays, again, because he didn't have the list to work with, he had PDFs that were different for each overlay. So water management, wildlife, whatever it was, they're all there. Road closures, restructure. So this was quite a lot of difficult work. He also went back and looked at the actual council policies just in case there was something that would guide planning. So for example, a Victorian council might have a policy relevant to transmission lines, unlikely, but they might have something, for example, around wind farms. So if you are proposing a development to develop an area of country Victoria to put a wind farm in, then you would want to know about that policy and you'd want to read it in detail because you might be chewing off something that just wasn't socially acceptable in that area. And so you'd really need to think about that beforehand. So this is also important because sometimes there might be requirements for another authority, so not the council, to get involved, an electricity authority, a water authority. So in this case, a veg survey was required of the whole corridor. So this table here identifies the area where there's an environmental significant overlay. But rather than going in and doing particular environmental management reports, there was a survey done of the whole corridor. So that more than ticked off on that. So you can see he's listed the local government area, he's listed the code of the overlay, the name of the overlay, so that top one in Ballarat, ESO 3, environmental significant overlay under Schedule 3, no action was needed there. Going down under ESO2, so another environmentally significant area under Schedule 2, no change. Go to the final one, Greater Geelong, another environment overlay, likely to require a fauna and flora assessment. So again, this was taken care of because they surveyed the whole corridor. But yeah, this is the kind of work that's triggered by the overlays. Public notification and representation. So there's different requirements of notification depending on what you're proposing. The standard development applications requirements found in the Tasmanian legislation, so we're back in Tasmania now under LUPAA, is found in Section 9, Notice of Application for a Permit. For the purposes of Section 57 of the Act, so this is discretionary applications, notice by a planning authority of an application for a permit has to be advertised in a daily newspaper, council has to bear the cost, displayed at the planning authority's office, council offices, given to the owners and occupiers. So if you're renting a building next to a planned development, then you might not open a letter that's addressed to the owner, so you might need your own letter that says occupier or householder. And the notice of application actually does need to be displayed on the land, so it needs to be of a certain size. So for those of us who need reading glasses, you shouldn't have to run home and get them. And it needs to be quite close to the public boundary, so you're not actually needing to trespass on the land to read that. And as we've said earlier, if this is quite a big development such as a subdivision, there might need to be signs all over the place, 20 or more signs, just to cover all of those different frontages where somebody might wander past and want information about the nature of the permit, and so that needs to be there. Sometimes this doesn't go all that smoothly. The council makes mistakes. Sometimes the actual paper printing, the advertisement makes a mistake with the address or some other detail. It's incomplete and it needs to be re-advertised. And that will actually be flagged in the ad that it's re-advertisement for whatever reason. So public notification representation, if you're cross about something, here's where you get to have your say. The opportunity to make representations is different depending on which application process that you're going through. The reason for putting this up is that LUPAA defines a representation both as those that are in support of as well as opposition to the draft application or project. That's that very last line there of the copied section of LUPAA. So this is important because if you're writing in support, the planning report does actually need to include those representations that support. So it can't just be dealing with all the problems that people raise, because the ratio and the level of support versus opposition is something that the planning authority will need to consider. The other thing to mention here is that you can also withdraw an application, and so it might be something that gets resolved as part of a negotiation between the various stakeholders. A neighbour puts in a representation opposing. The council, for example, Clarence City Council, has a threshold that they go to extra lengths if there's any representations at all. So the planning manager can make a decision about an application if nobody has put in a representation. So it might be in the council office's interest to figure out exactly what that representation is and whether the problem can be dealt with by talking to the stakeholders and perhaps having that stakeholder withdraw a representation and dealing with the change that they might need, the compromise through a permit condition. So obviously, if they're objecting to something like the height of the building, then that's a really substantial change, and you can't put permit conditions around such a substantial change because it's essentially altering the development application. But if it's something around making the fence a little bit lower, having heritage paint colours, that kind of fairly minor thing, then yeah, that can be part of a permit condition, which can smooth the whole process out. So we're not talking about dodgy dealings here. We're just talking about smart work by the planner to try to process things efficiently. So you hear all this talk about red tape in Tasmania, cutting red tape. A lot of it is about having skilled planners who know the legislation, who know the planning scheme really well, who are good at dealing with people, who are able to take each case on its merits and deal with it efficiently. So we'll deal with this down the track when we talk about planning change, but a skilled planner who is experienced is just so valuable. Nearly there. So public notifications, there's no opportunity for representation under a permitted application, so that's section 58 of LUPAA. But under 57, an advertised development application right of representation is provided by section 5 of that section 57. So that says any person may make representation relating to the application during the period of 14 days commencing on the date on which the notice of application is given. So when that sign goes up on the boundary that you notice when you're walking the dog past, you've got a couple of weeks to say something if you want to support that or you want to oppose it. And finally, last slide, everybody has an expectation that they will be dealt with fairly under the planning process. So again, this is where good management by council can meet problems with common sense and good communication. So council officers will inform people, whether that's the applicant, affected people like neighbours, the general public, in a way that they can understand. You can't expect, say as a member of the public, addressing that first off point, that you're going to be involved in everything at all times. The planning scheme sets out the ways and times that various stakeholders can be involved. And equally, and this is something that we've emphasised, Jared has emphasised in the manual, you can't tell an applicant, as either a consultant or as an officer of the planning authority, exactly what the outcome is going to be. Particularly if it's going to go to some sort of city planning committee or to a full meeting of council, you don't know what the aldermen are going to say. It might become a bit more of a political football. But if there are no issues, in this case as current city council, there are no issues, there's no representations, then it's the council officer writing the report that goes to the manager of planning to approve, and they're likely to approve it exactly as the assessing officer writes it. So in that case, you wouldn't actually say to the applicant, this is definitely going to get approved, but you'd use careful language to say, this is going to go to my manager. My manager generally takes my advice. Here's what I'm going to say. Make of that what you will. So again, while we might have expectations in terms of the public, the applicant, the general community, the planning authority about good planning outcomes, there is nothing in the zoning regulations that cover bad taste. So I'm referring to the cartoon here. So you might have a say on your neighbour's aubergine house, and in fact not my immediate neighbour but the next one over did put on an extension, and it is bright purple and it blocks our view of the mountain, and we happened to be in Canberra for the whole year that this all happened. There was nothing in the zoning regulations that didn't allow that, even though we're in a heritage zone. It was all ticked off, nothing can be done about it. So there you go. It's good to know what is and isn't possible under the planning scheme, and where you feel so inclined, have your say, but know where that boundary is between what you can affect and what you can't.